Hello, this is Michael Tracy. In this video, we'll look at the pseudo-scientific work being done by the Turner twins relating to Mallory and Irvine's 1924 climb. Recently, two explorers, Hugo and Ross Turner, who happen to be twins, announced they will conduct yet another replica choline experiment related to the 1924 climb. While purporting to bring some clarity to what is being called the mystery of Mallory and Irvine, it is not clear how their analysis of the clothing will add anything to the debate. The twins have already announced what they expect the results of their experiment to be. Namely, they think that Mallory's clothing, especially the boots, were far better than most people think, and that they personally believe it is, quote, more than likely that Mallory and Irvine reached the summit. My criticism of the project is thus completely unrelated to the conclusions it may draw, but rather the completely unscientific methods being used, including prominently announcing what you think the results will be prior to completing the experiment. The 2025 version is essentially a redo of the Turner twins' earlier Mallory and Irvine study they conducted by climbing Mount Everest back in 2015, purporting to answer the exact same questions. That is, they had some type of replica clothing, which one twin wore while the other twin wore modern clothing. They then performed a variety of tests to determine cortisol levels and oxygen levels. From this, they made the remarkable scientific breakthrough that the higher up you climb, the lower your oxygen levels are. Although their study has not been picked up by any legitimate medical publications, it is now 10 years later, and the twins are back touting the exact same test, even though the tests are still not being performed at anywhere near Mount Everest altitudes. This time around, it will be the 6,476-meter Mera Peak, which is roughly the altitude of Advanced Base Camp on the Tibetan side of Everest. The twins are currently in Nepal doing the climb, but might be finished by the time I release this video. This iteration of the study has attracted interest from the Mallory and Irvine enthusiasts, but not for the reasons the Turner twins likely intended. The main interest in the 2025 study is using it to test your Yeti senses. For instance, the twins claim that they are climbing Mera Peak in Nepal because Everest would be too crowded to carry out scientific research. Of course, few people climb Everest in the fall, and the north side is rarely crowded, even during the spring season. They are again touting the benefits of using a pair of twins in the study, even though this is completely unnecessary. For instance, they had both twins sitting in a cold chamber, one wearing the 1924 replica clothing and the other modern clothing, while medical measurements were taken. There's absolutely no reason that you need to do twins to do this. You could simply have a single person change clothing and take the exact same measurements on the exact same person. In addition, you could use different sized people to see how the clothing might work better for larger framed people, such as Irvine, or people with the more svelte figure of Mallory. A quick look at their sponsor, Montaigne's website, shows that their 8,000-meter clothing primarily uses down for insulation. So there have been no radical improvements in high-altitude insulation in the past 100 years. George Finch used a down parka in 1922, and Mallory could have used such a parka, but chose the less bulky custom-made Shackleton jacket. My main criticism of the experiments are that they will not contribute anything to understanding what happened in 1924. There is a common trope that 1924 clothing was inadequate without anyone ever explaining what it was inadequate for. The one thing we know with absolute certainty is that the 1924 clothing was adequate for reasonably fit climbers to climb without oxygen on the north side of Everest to at least 28,000 feet and return to camp safely. We know this because Norton, Somervell, Smythe, and Wyn-Harris all reached at least 28,000 feet and all returned safely to camp. Norton, Smythe, and Wyn-Harris reached above 28,100. Norton and Somervell left their high camp at 6:40 a.m. and were back at North Col at 9:30 p.m. So we know with absolute certainty that the 1924 clothing was adequate to climb to 28,000 feet and remain in the open for a total climb time of 14 hours and 50 minutes without using oxygen. From this, it is not clear what the mystery about the clothing actually is. Is there a legitimate belief that there is some point between the 28,126 feet which Norton climbed to and the 29,035-foot summit, at which point the clothing disintegrates or otherwise loses its thermal properties? Noel Odell climbed the 7,817-meter Nanda Devi in 1936, so clearly the clothing is adequate to climb technical peaks up to that altitude. Climbing the 6,476 Mera Peak will tell us nothing about the adequacy of the clothing that we don't already know. Equally important is that no legitimate researchers of Mallory and Irvine are claiming that the clothing made them immune from the cold or somehow had thermal properties far beyond modern clothing. That is the straw man argument made by those selling a mystery rather than trying to explain what happened. Instead, the argument actually made in favor of them reaching the summit is that Mallory and Irvine chose lighter, less bulky clothing, favoring speed as their primary strategy, a strategy that ultimately failed to return them to camp safely. There's no question that the 1924 clothing would not be adequate for climbers to spend 24 hours out in the open above 8,000 meters. No one is claiming that it was, and that has nothing to do with whether they reached the summit. It has to do with one of the many reasons why they died. For 1924, we have photographs of the mountain from afternoon to sunset on June 8th, so we know there was no storm, the sky was clear by early evening, and there's no visible plume coming off the mountain, indicating extremely low winds at that time. Given that we know with absolute certainty that the clothing and equipment was adequate to reach 28,126 feet in 1924, and there is no scientific reason to believe that the last 900 feet would radically alter the thermal properties of the clothing, the only issue of adequacy becomes how long the climbers could remain in the open, high on the mountain, before becoming hypothermic. If Mallory and Irvine could have made the round trip back to high camp in just 12 hours, the clothing would have been perfectly adequate. If it took 24 hours, they would freeze to death somewhere along the way, though the lack of oxygen and being out of hot water would also have played a role. One must also wonder why none of the dozens of climbers on the early British expeditions thought their clothing was inadequate. To the contrary, the 1924 team wrote a detailed report about the expedition and analyzed numerous things that they could have done differently or that needed improvement. They recommended that expedition members learn basic Nepali or Tibetan so that rudimentary communications could be performed with the porters. They recommended that a party should set things up in Darjeeling well in advance of the main expedition. They recommended additional rest days on the trek in. They recommended that each member should purchase a good pony, and so on. There are numerous recommendations for improvement. Absolutely none of them were to bring warmer clothing. The only recommendations on clothing were that the expedition leader should dress better when meeting with Tibetan officials. In addition, when making gifts of clothing to these officials, these should favor more expensive hats, but not any scarves, because scarves were not appreciated by the Tibetans. They also recommended that a bootmaker should be present to repair the boots and reattach the hobnails to the boots. There's an entire section in the expedition report captioned Clothing and Equipment. The thing that sticks out is how many items are labeled as satisfactory. If their clothing and equipment was completely inadequate, one must wonder why no one on the expedition made a note of it. One must also wonder why so many subsequent expeditions also attempted the mountain using the same clothing and equipment. We can also look at Anchor and Holding's 2007 climb, where they used replica clothing. Holding and Anchor took the replica clothing off, lower down the mountain, so it tells us nothing about its adequacy. For future researchers wishing to put together some type of experiment with the clothing, it is essential to first match the established baselines of the 1924 climbers. Whichever climbers you are using, they should first climb to Norton's high point at 28,126 feet without using oxygen and with the same climb rate of Norton. That needs to be established as a baseline first. If a modern climber using 1924 equipment cannot duplicate what they did in 1924, then it is not the clothing that is inadequate, it is the climber. Of course, there's no problem using modern protection or ropes, provided that the climbers perform the climbing itself without direct Sherpa support or oxygen above high camp, just the way Norton, Smythe, and Wyn-Harris did it. Lower down, modern climbers using 1924 equipment should be able to duplicate the known climb times of Odell. Odell stated that Mallory was a faster climber than himself, so if you can't duplicate Odell's known climb times between North Col and high camp with 1924 equipment, then it is again the climber that is inadequate, not the clothing. Despite the significant interest in the 1924 expedition, no modern climbers have attempted to duplicate the climbs of Norton, Somervell, or Odell. We are just told how much better the modern equipment is and left wondering why Conrad Anker, Leo Holding, and Mark Sinnott were not able to climb anywhere close to as fast as Odell. We do have a possible explanation for this in the early replica clothing work done by Graham Hoyland. Well, prior to his 2013 book, Hoyland had some interesting theories about the 1924 climb. Based on statements made by his relative, Howard Somervell, Hoyland surmised that Mallory and Irvine were seen by Odell at the third step, after climbing the area of loose rock below that step, the area which I call the zigzag route. Hoyland felt they had reached the summit because the weather was good that day and their clothing perfectly adequate. Hoyland even made replica clothing and used it on Everest. Hoyland was very confident Mallory and Irvine reached the summit, noting that his experiment with the clothing was, quote, just another brick in my wall of evidence. At least that's what he was saying in 2006. Indeed, there is a massive wall of evidence that Mallory and Irvine reached the summit, most prominently that they died, and people on summit bids overwhelmingly die on the descent from the summit. But there is also the large amount of oxygen they took up with them. In fact, their oxygen equipment was pound per liter of oxygen, nearly identical to that of Norgay and Hillary's. That photographs of the mountain that day show no storm, with a clear sky and low winds in the evening, and Mallory's watch was pressed into place, still wound at 1:27, and started ticking again when the obstructions were cleared. There are numerous additional pieces in this wall of evidence, but more interesting is what happened to Hoyland's theory. Hoyland was already a published author, and yet he could not publish a book about his massive wall of evidence. Instead, in 2013, his book came out, and it said the exact opposite of everything he had been saying for the past decade. Equally important is the legitimate research put together by Professors Mary Rose and Mike Parsons, authors of the excellent book Invisible on Everest, which analyzes early mountaineering clothing. Back in 2006, Parsons noted, the results stand out as a challenge for future outdoor innovators because Mallory's clothing and footwear was 20% and 40% lighter, respectively. That insight highlights the key to understanding any study of the clothing. The question is not whose clothing will be warmer, it is which clothing can offer that warmth at the weight and allow for flexible and breathable clothing. Back in 2006, Hoyland commented, quote, when exposed to a cutting wind blowing off the main Rongbach Glacier, I found the true value of the gabardine outer layers. They resisted the wind and allowed the 8 layers beneath to trap warmed air between them and my skin. We both got too hot working on the glacier, so we felt that Mallory's clothing would have been more than adequate to climb to the top end, although it would be hard to survive a bivouac near the summit. Hoyland noted that Russell Bryce felt a similar way. Bryce pointed out that in some ways this outfit and the nailed boots that went with it would have been better for climbing the mixed ground on the north face than today's clumsy down gear and plastic double boots. Unfortunately, while Hoyland provides a lot of useful information, ultimately he backtracked from his decades-long belief that they reached the summit and wrote, I stood on the summit in a 20-knot wind in October 1993 with a lenticular cloud over my head. The temperature was well below -20 Celsius. I was wearing a modern down suit and was barely warm enough. If I had been wearing Mallory's clothes, I don't think I would have survived the day. Ultimately, in his book, Hoyland concludes, after the clothing test, I felt I had learned a great deal, that the clothing would have been just good enough to wear to the summit in warm, windless conditions, but probably could not have kept the climbers alive if bad weather had come in, or if they had to spend a night bivouacking on the slopes. I'm not sure why he felt the need to mention this. No one is contending that Mallory and Irvine survived. We all know they died. They died high on the mountain. If the cause of their death was that they were too cold, because it was late at night and getting extremely cold, we should not be examining the clothing. We should be wondering why they were still there on the mountain that late at night. This is the ultimate problem with all the clothing and equipment theories. If Mallory and Irvine turned around early, there is no question their clothing and equipment was perfectly adequate to reach the second step, spend an hour or two attempting it, turn around, and make it back to camp just fine. Others had done similar climbs, Norton, Smythe, Wyn-Harris. They all climbed to just over 28,100 feet, where they turned around after having given it a good go. On the other hand, if Mallory and Irvine were running late, no one contends that their clothing would allow them to spend 24 hours in the open on the upper mountain. Using 12 hours as an approximation for their oxygen, they needed to be back at high camp after around 12 hours, as the chances of dying greatly increase once they ran out of oxygen and are a near certainty once the moon set late that night. Given that they did die, their deaths are explained perfectly by the wealth of information available. There is no mystery that their clothing was adequate for at least 14 or 15-hour climb, as Norton and Somervell had done exactly that. The only mystery is what Mallory and Irvine were still doing after 15 plus hours of climbing. And if you honestly try to answer that question, you will see there is no mystery at all.